From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You're listening to the Big Ideas podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, Professor of English and American Culture Studies and the Director of ICS. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations present and past who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties and our efforts towards decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who've been living and working on this land from time immemorial. My guests today are Michele Stevenson and Rene Ayala. Michele is a documentary filmmaker with Haitian and Panamanian roots. She's the keynote speaker at this year's Latino IX Conference. Rene is a BGSU Ph.D. student in American Culture Studies whose research interests include the study of race and ethnicity in the U.S. and Latin America. He's also a graduate assistant at ICS. Thanks for joining me today. Michele, can you tell us a little bit about the path that led you into filmmaking and to the kinds of films that you make?
Okay, well, thank you for having me here, and I want to thank the Institute and the school for inviting me to sort of share my work and ideas. It's kind of a long, circuitous journey. It's not my first career. I come from a very politicized family. We fled Haiti under the dictatorship under Duvalier because my family was involved in pro-democracy sort of movements there, and so we had to flee. And so I grew up around a lot of conversations, intentionality around identity, politics, human rights, while at the same time, sort of a modest working class, middle class upbringing. And so I had to figure out how was I going to sort of do the work that I wanted to do around social change, but also feed myself. So long story short, I pursued a career in international development, which I hated for a number of reasons. Being someone who had studied a lot of social feminism and Fanon and all of these sort of works, when I ended up in this environment in West Africa working for the United Nations Development Program, I found myself in the keg of this wheel, this industrial complex wheel of which I was sort of contributing. And so I decided to leave and go to law school, thinking that with law I could do more direct sort of human rights work. And that's when the turning point happened. I ended up at Columbia Law School, but I also met my future partner, who was already doing work in film, but with a very specific intention around representation. He is a Black American from Los Angeles. And so I became exposed to that work and wanted to leave law school. My first experience was I was concentrating on human rights, and I went to this internship with this Afro-Brazilian women's organization in Sao Paulo, Brazil, called Galedes, and they've done a lot of amazing work down there. And I took a camera with me, but with the encouragement of my partner, and started to do some documentation with these feminist hip-hop artists, women who were working in the peripheries of Sao Paulo. And I got the bug because by day I was working on legislation, anti-racist legislation, and then by night I was filming and creating sort of working on these relationships that were built about trust, but also representation and validation of each other. And so when I went back, I said, this is what I really want to do. But of course, it took a number of years to get to that. My partner encouraged me not to drop out of law school.
There's the feeding yourself, right?
Right, exactly. Which is interesting because I think with the passion and intention, you end up finding a way. But there's always that thing behind, like, can I really take the leap and be the full artist that I want to be without any points of reference really around me? And so it took about 5 years. It was important to practice law for a bit, bought a house to have some more sort of independence, and then, sort of the rest is history, and that's how I've come here. And for me, when we look at culture and what culture can do to make change, It doesn't matter what legislation you have on the books. If the culture is not meeting it, we're not going to be able to enforce it. So I see myself as a cultural shifter, a cultural changer through the artist and through storytelling, because narrative is really what it's all about in terms of whether we see ourselves and how can we move forward. There has to be a narrative reference for us to be able to move forward. So I see that as a very important work, but also that sort of feeds my soul.
Much of your work is documentary in nature. Could you talk about how you think about using and or challenging the medium of film to tell the kinds of stories you want to tell?
There are a couple of ways of breaking this down. I think one is the notion of point of view, right? I always come with a very specific point of view and baggage in my interactions and in telling the stories, and I'm very conscious of it. And there's an intentionality in terms of how I engage with participants in the nonfiction space. So that's one that I think doesn't happen enough. A lot of our sort of white storyteller counterparts often don't question their own baggage in the relationships that happen and in the stories that they tell. And so for me, it's kind of front and center. I'm also very focused on process. The process of creativity is very collaborative, certainly in the filmmaking. And so how do we honor the collaboration and sort of rework what hierarchy looks like and understand that the exchanges with participants are about trying to achieve equality as much as possible. But it also is important for us to acknowledge that documentary filmmaking is extractive fundamentally. For those who have studied documentary film, you know, we often say that sort of Nanook of the North is the birth of documentary film. And there's nothing more fake than that film and who the audience was. It was definitely convincing or showing to a dominant white audience, Inuit culture, quote unquote, that even those who were in the film were not practicing. And then we still engage in some of those extractive practices. So it's really about questioning that. And then for me, the first audience is myself. It's my community, right? And I do believe that the more specific we are in the stories that we tell, the more relevant it will be for everybody, because we're all human. And our human stories can be shared with the specificities that we can engage in.
Rene, can you talk about your own intellectual and professional journey to this point? What were some of those kind of major experiences that have shaped your thinking about Afro-Latinx history and representation?
Okay, so I would say that my sort of journey to grad school really began in undergrad, specifically when I was a first-year undergraduate student, where I had encountered a podcast from Latino USA about Afro-Latinos and Afro-Latino identity. And what I really enjoyed about the podcast was that it gave me a way to express concepts, ideas that I had and felt for a while, but had not been able to describe because I hadn't encountered the term Afro-Latino beforehand. And even in my formal education, I had not seen anything about Afro-Latino. So it was very much like I understood a sense of sort of Blackness and Latinidad as separate. So then it conflicted with how I was understanding my own experiences. So then the sort of intellectual curiosity of the podcast made me more interested in wanting to pursue research on Afro-Latinos, and I was able to do that in undergrad through a research fellowship where I was able, in the last 2 years of my undergrad, to focus on a project where I was looking at how Afro-Latino identity was being negotiated and debated in social media. And I actually had the opportunity to present that project as like a close to final version of that at the Latino IX Conference in 2019 when I was still an undergrad. And that was, I think, either right before or right around the time I had learned that I got accepted to the master's program here. So it was an opportunity to come here, both to present and then also to sort of explore the campus when I was considering to attend as a master's student in the American Culture Studies program at the time. So then when I went to grad school, I was trying to figure out like what exactly I wanted to do for my research. I was sort of trying to figure out if I wanted to just do ethnic studies stuff more broadly. For a time, I debated whether I wanted to maybe focus more on a secondary research interest that I have, which is on DNA ancestry testing, and particularly how that's marketed through advertisements. And I did that for my master's thesis, and I enjoyed the project enough, but when I was considering what I wanted to do for the PhD, I realized I really wanted to sort of go back to what originally interested me about going to grad school and sort of reinvigorated my interest in Afro-Latino studies. And that is what I'm sort of hoping to really focus on for my dissertation project.
you're both really talking about, Michele, you said, you need changes in culture in order to actually make legislative changes happen. And Rene, you're really talking about the impact of recognition, right, and representation and helping kind of snap into focus things about your own experience. Michele, anything that you would want to add about kind of why it's so important for us to attend to the cultural, even as we are also attending to other arenas for social change?
I think we're living in a moment, and I think, well, maybe always have, but it's probably maybe a little more acute, of a battle of narratives, right? Narrative is what builds identity. Narrative is what builds a sense of community and society. And there is a battle of whose narrative is going to be the light and the light for moving forward for our country, for the globe, really. in some cases, whether even we're talking about a narrative around the environment or other things. And it's a point where, facts don't really matter, right? So what do we use? What do we engage in to kind of shift the dial, even for the survival of our own humanity? And I think it happens in the cultural space. And for me also, the telling of stories is also about healing, right? Very much about healing, both on a personal and a community level. So I think about that a lot when I'm building stories or choosing stories, because it's through that storytelling and healing process that we can also find the strength to move forward, to make whatever changes we feel are necessary, individually or larger. So it's also sort of a form of support. The narrative building, the building of research that supports the narratives as well.
Yeah.
So there's sort of an interchange. I often turn to theory, to academia, to sort of inspire me in terms of different ways of looking at how I can tell stories. And so I'm saying that there are different levels, but for me, the healing and community part of exchange and finding strength in our common narrative is really at the center. And then everything else that ripples effects from that.
Rene, you helped organize this year's Latino IX Issues Conference. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the conference?
Yes, so this year would mark the 27th annual Latino Issues Conference, but the conference officially started in 1995, originally housed under what is today known as the Office of Multicultural Affairs. It was a collaboration between faculty, staff, and students, particularly those in the Latino Student Union. And the aim was to create a space to explore issues pertinent to the Latino Hispanic community in Bowling Green State University, but then also the Bowling Green and larger Northwest Ohio area. So over the years, there's been a lot of university adjustments that have caused the conference to occasionally sometimes have some years where there wasn't a conference, which is why it's a 27th annual conference, but some of the years might not have. There's also, of course, the 2020 conference that didn't happen, but now the conference is officially housed under the School of Cultural and Critical Studies and is a collaboration done by 5 organizations: the ICS Latino and Latin American Studies Cluster, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, the Department of Ethnic Studies, the School of Cultural and Critical Studies, and the Latino Student Union.
So, Rene, what are some of the highlights of the 2023 conference, and how do you see it sort of shaping the social climate for students at BGSU?
So this year we decided to have an official theme. We sometimes have a theme and sometimes don't for the conference, but the theme for this year is We Are Multitudes. And it was decided among our organizing committee, which is made up of faculty, staff, and students, both undergraduate and graduate. And the idea that we had with the theme was we were trying to think about expanding beyond maybe sort of what we often think about when we think about either Latino issues or Latino studies. So we were really trying to think about how we can maybe expand the different types of groups that we often focus on. So we could think about expanding beyond particular or like work that addresses different types of representations of Latinos that might be interesting and unique. And also really thinking about both what maybe unites different Latino and Latin American communities, but also what are potential divisions or points of tension between communities. I really wanted to honor that and think about how differences within these communities doesn't necessarily have to be sort of antagonistic, but can be a space for collaboration. So we were really trying to emphasize that in the call for papers and the panels that we're organizing. So for example, we have 2 what we call spotlight panels, which are invited panels where representatives from different organizations in the Northwest Ohio area that focus on the Latino community in Northwest Ohio, where they'll be addressing the multitudes or the particularities of the Northwest Ohio Latino community, as well as a spotlight panel that was organized by the Latino Student Union, which will incorporate both graduate and undergraduate students from different Latino backgrounds that will discuss their experiences at BGSU. And we also had the honor of being able to screen Michele Stevenson's Stateless on Tuesday night, which specifically addresses the history of anti-Black racism between Haiti and the Dominican Republic and the tensions that exist between the nations.
Michele, your most recent film, which is being screened as part of the conference, is called Stateless, Apatrida, which is about the history and contemporary politics of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Can you sort of try and describe the project for our listeners? I hope they'll go out and screen the film themselves, but what would you tell them? And what are you hoping that audiences see, hear, feel, and learn from that film?
Just one correction. It's
please.
not my most recent
Oh,
feature.
it's not? Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I actually, Going to Mars is our most featured, and we won at Sundance Grand Jury Prize.
Congratulations.
A month
I buried
ago,
the lead.
Yeah, exactly. So I got to make that correction. So if that's,
Yes,
so,
please.
Yeah.
Okay,
So, yes.
your previous film, Stateless, Apatrida, is being screened as part of this. So tell us a little bit about that film, its genesis, and kind of what you're hoping for audiences to take away.
Okay. The genesis of deciding to engage in this film, which took almost 6 years to make, was the 2013 Dominican Republic Supreme Court decision they call La Sentencia, which basically denationalized in one fell swoop the birthright citizenship of Dominicans of Haitian ancestry and made that retroactive to 1929, which is when the official border was established under U.S. occupation of the island. And so for me, I was just coming out of a feature-length doc that I had done, which was a very personal 13-year film called American Promise, looking at the educational system through the eyes of my son and his best friend. And for me, again, speaking to what we had earlier spoke about, it's always a personal sort of that drives the stories. And being someone who was born on the island, who was sort of familiar both of the political, cultural relationship between the DR and Haiti, both very personal. I have family members who are married to Dominicans, family members who live there, but also understanding the tense history behind it. This was an opportunity for me to go to the island, spend more time there, and sometimes as kind of a pretext, but also to sort of unpack the intergenerational trauma also that was part of my own growing up, and really examine anti-Blackness in this specific community. And so sort of the rest is history. I was able to engage through connections that I had in the past in my human rights work with Dominicans of Haitian descent, human rights activists, fighting for their own rights in the DR, and came across some really special people, including Rosairis Diendomi Alvarez, who is the lead in this film, and the work that she's done as a lawyer as well, to recognize and push for the full citizenship of her compatriots. She is half Dominican, of Dominican descent, and half Dominican of Haitian descent. Her father was born in Haiti. And I think it's really about lifting the veil of what racism looks like in our communities and sort of confronting it face on.
Michele, how did you think about, for that particular film, the cinematic techniques that you wanted to use? And I don't know if this is a related or a separate question for you. In what ways were you thinking about the way you told the story as part of the kind of telling the message of this injustice and of moving towards a more equitable process?
Yeah, so in some ways I am an artist first, because I really sort of thrive out of engaging with the material, looking for creative ways to tell stories that sort of push the boundaries. At that time, when I started the research and working on the film, I was very much grounded in observational documentary, which is what I had done primarily, and, straight sort of interviews as well. But I wanted to go beyond that, and I wanted to engage with the history of the island and make connections that sort of collapsed time. And one of my intentions was to really highlight the genocidal massacre of 1937 that took place along the Dominican-Haitian border. It was through the execution under the ruling of the dictatorship of Trujillo to basically massacre and eliminate tens of thousands of Haitians and darker-skinned Dominicans of Haitian descent. And in some cases, darker-skinned Dominicans were also killed because there was no way of sort of making the differentiation in some cases. It is a part of our history, I think of our common hemispheric history, that we're not aware of. It's one of the larger massacres of genocidal extermination that have taken place in one fell swoop within a week across the Americas, and nobody knows about it. And I think there's a reason why nobody even knows about it. It's about the lack of value of Black bodies and the way also Haiti is perceived on a hemispheric level. So I needed to bring that up. But I also brought with that this tradition of magical realism that I wanted to explore, that comes from our communities. That sort of is a way I was raised in terms of how stories were told to me as a young girl, and wanted to use that device to engage with history in a way that it hit us differently as opposed to, trauma porn, right? And so there was a interplay and conversation between the work that Rosa Iris was doing from an observational perspective and this lyrical, magical realist story of this young woman called Moraine in the narrative. So it was this fable that sort of underpinned the reality of what was going on today. So it was also an attempt at deconstructing this linear view of history and looking at the circularity of how things keep happening. They may change face, but in some ways that denationalization, that Supreme Court decision was an act of state-sanctioned genocide too. When you make people invisible in one fell swoop through the law, it's not a violent act, but it is an act of violence. It's not physical violence, but it is emotional, spiritual, and a legal act of violence. So I wanted to also make those parallels.
You've talked about trying to think about film as a collaborative process and sort of to change that relationship between kind of the filmmaker and the subjects. Can you give us some examples of kind of the ways in which, maybe for this film in particular, you were changing that relationship between being behind the camera and who's in front of it?
The work with Rosa Iris was very collaborative. I sort of in some ways took her lead in terms of where the story was going. And she became sort of this full participant, actually calling me and making suggestions, because we allowed for that space to happen in the relationship and the investment in the story to be equal in that sense. And she brought on, one of our main participants, his name Teofilo Murat, who she felt was a classic example of what statelessness does to people. And he was her cousin. And it's only through her that we were able to access him, and she brought him on as part of this collaborative process. And we together found ways of telling his story that were deeply emotional and in which she was involved in. That's on the side of the production side. But there's also the distribution side. Rosa Iris has taken ownership of the film, and she has traveled with the film on her own. She's gone as far as the UK virtually, because this film came out virtually, but she has engaged with the film in her community. She was granted asylum and lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and has done a number of things with the film that I've sort of we have let go with that, because it's very important for her to sort of represent it, compensate it on multiple levels for it. And that's another aspect, right? Money. I don't really believe in this idea that journalism brings on to us, that you cannot pay the participant in a film when you're getting paid, right? And so how do you engage in these positions and relationships of power where sometimes you're in situations where some of the people you're working with may not have enough to feed themselves the next day? So how do we compensate for that? How do we engage with that in a way that's respectful and vulnerable at the same time, and recognize those power dynamics? We found creative ways in the production as well as in the distribution, in terms of her being able to be compensated for her participation in the film.
We're going to take a quick break. Thanks for listening to the Big Ideas podcast.
Question. Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Welcome back to the Big Ideas podcast. Today I'm speaking with filmmaker Michele Stevenson and BGSU Ph.D. student and ICS graduate assistant Rene, Ayala, about filmmaking and the Latino Issues Conference held here at BGSU in March 2023. Michele, your keynote at the talk is entitled The Limits of Latinidad Toward a Liberatory Practice. Can you give us some highlights of some of the ideas you wanted to share with attendees about the role of anti-Blackness in Latinidad identity?
Well, I think for me, the biggest takeaway as I was, writing, figuring out what I was going to talk about is really how we have internalized anti-Blackness in our communities. It's in our conversations. It's in how we talk about each other, from, bettering the race to, even where's your grandmother? ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? Has to do with hiding our Black ancestry and how the pain and intergenerational trauma that has caused. And we bring that with us to the United States, and then sometimes it becomes in full clash with the more delineated sort of Jim Crow, one drop blood rule here that happens. And so this collision for some people becomes a whole sort of, how do I even reconstruct my identity based on these experiences in the past? So I sort of go back in a little bit in history to understand the nature of anti-Blackness that is Latin American, and that in some cases we can't really go forward without acknowledging that within our own communities, and that whatever we talk about what Latinidad means, it has to engage with the violent legacy that still persists today within our communities. So I don't want Latinidad to hide it, right? This mestizaje pride is fraught with tension. If we're celebrating our mixture, what are we celebrating really? And that's sort of the question that I sort of leave people with in terms of how do you unpack that in a way that acknowledges, because I truly believe that, well, not just believe, I think the history tells us that white supremacy and racial capitalism is from as far down as Argentina to as far north as Canada. We can't escape it. And so we can't hide behind labels. And even now, I think there are issues in the census that are being brought up around Latinx being a race, which is very dangerous. So anyway, it's more these provocations that have to do with my own personal upbringing and what I heard and listened to as a child, that certain parts of my family were deeply fighting against, but others were absorbed and internalized and practiced it here in this country. And I don't think my experience is unique, and I'm hoping that other people will identify with it and think about how they engage with their work differently from that perspective.
Rene, you're in your second year of the PhD program. Can you talk to us about kind of where your dissertation research is heading and kind of what stage in the process you are?
Right. So right now I'm in the process of figuring out the details of my proposal. So I have a general idea that what I want to do for the proposal is related to how Blackness manifests within American or Peruvian migrant communities in the U.S. And what I'm envisioning is thinking about how the way that Blackness exists in Peruvian communities is related to both U.S. racial structures as well as Peruvian racial structures. I'm trying to figure out exactly how I want to examine that. I'm currently between whether I want to look at Afro-Peruvians specifically, so maybe how Afro-Peruvian migrants or Afro-Peruvian Americans conceptualize Blackness, how they maybe understand their Blackness, or if they identify with a Black identity. So that's sort of one potential avenue I'm considering. Another is thinking about the Peruvian community more broadly and seeing how Blackness either does or does not show up, and how race is discussed within Peruvian migrant communities or Peruvian American communities. And for both avenues of those potential projects, I'm really interested in thinking about how the process of migration itself is impacting those different processes.
On that note, I actually did want to sort of highlight another aspect of the talk, because it's not all about our internalized oppressions too. I think there are ways of looking at the history of our cultures, specifically looking at the maroon societies and the cimarronaje and maroonage that has happened across the continents as reference points of liberation, of migration, of search for freedom. So I think that where there was slavery and where there was oppression, there was also resistance, and there was this search for freedom that I feel we really haven't culled at all. And it's so ripe for not just further research, but further stories that can serve as a reference point for us. And that's kind of the liberatory practice part of the thing. So we don't want to leave it all in this notion of we've internalized all this, how do we get out of it? There are reference points that we can turn to in history and in stories that can serve as a reference for us.
And Rene, as you're in the early processes of figuring out your own research practice and the stories you want to tell, what are you thinking about in terms of the methods that make sense for you and for your research? And what relationship are you going to try and cultivate between yourself and your research subjects?
All right, so that actually is sort of the crucial point that I'm at right now, because I originally envisioned that the project would maybe be something that's a little bit more historical, like archival methods, but part of the issue is not only sort of is the focus on Peruvian migrants limited in the secondary literature within Latino studies or Afro-Latino studies, there also isn't so much of an archival record per se. So, or at least not an archival record in the way that like would be the most ideal for me, like particularly like Afro or Peruvian migrants or stuff like that. So I've been warming up to the idea of doing interviews, either like in a sociological way or oral history interviews, as a way to be able to really unpack how processes of identification or the processes of, say, like the state and how the state is impacting how people are understanding themselves and things like that, as well as how, if I'm taking the avenue of, say, how blackness does or doesn't show up in discourses around race within Peruvian American communities, sort of the interview can be a way to see how that is happening in real time. So that's where I'm at so far. I'm also would still be interested in thinking about combining that with different, I guess, sort of a mixed methods approach of maybe incorporating textual analysis of maybe social media, if I can find anything interesting in literature or media in other ways like TV or film or something that directly is addressing or trying to engage with Peruvian communities and race and identity within Peruvian communities, I might include that as well. And in terms of what I would want to develop a relationship with the research subjects, that's something that I've started to think about, at least in terms of like how I'm trying to go into this project, recognizing the ways that being born in the U.S. is shaping how I'm understanding what blackness is and how I want to then approach the project where I am simultaneously, want to explore Black Peruvians, blackness within Peru, and resist and invisibility of blackness within Peru, but also don't want to sort of ignore the ways that Black Peruvians themselves are understanding blackness, right? That there might be particularities that I'm not fully aware of, that I might be glossing over or imposing too much of a U.S.-centric understanding that I want to make sure that I'm aware of, especially if I'm also doing interviews in terms of a language, because I could potentially do interviews in either Spanish, English, and even Spanglish, but the concern would also be that there might be particular terms and ways that they're talking about that about race that I'm not fully aware of. I mean, I know at least with my mom, when I've talked about, informally about race in Peru, like there's so many, it's very clear that she has a completely different schema than I'm fully aware of. So I've been trying to think about like how will I engage with that in order to also, I think, really honor the fact that I want to understand particularities of the locale and how, sort of as an Afro-diasporic population within Peru specifically, how their particular context is shaping their understanding of blackness.
So you'll be traveling to Peru?
Unsure. I think for now...
Sounds like that's in your future.
I considered it. I think maybe for the time of the dissertation, I might reserve it to the U.S., but say if I wanted to expand it to a book or something later on, that might be a part of it.
How do you, this is really for both of you, how do you think about engaging with a larger sense of community? So not just the collaboration with kind of individual participants in a research project or in a film, but who do you consider your community? And how do you see your work being a part of building or supporting or expanding that community? And does it depend on the project, I guess?
Yeah, I think it depends on the project. For me, it's like there are multitudes of identities that I'm a part of that, depending on the film, have a different focus, right? In the case of Stateless, it was really the first sort of intention was around the Haitian and Dominican communities. and also laying a stake on the ground of this is something I actually wanted to add around when we make film, we're also a witness to our own history that lives beyond us. And so it was very important for me to ground certainly that this film in the potential that it could have in helping Dominican and Haitian communities. And it was part of the most fruitful sort of engagement that we have done with the film. At least for me, that was most gratifying. I can mention a few. The film screened Miami at the museum there, and it was some of the most engaging conversations that we had at the end of the screening. It also had an impact with some of the engagement we did with organizations in the United States, Dominican Haitian organizations that were also working in the DR and Haiti to rebuild our history, rebuild a common narrative around what our history is of the island. And those were also really strong engagements with the folks doing that kind of work. But one of the most touching, actually, that I'll always remember is a virtual screening that we did with Afro-Colombian Women's Organization. I had done some work on workshops on filmmaking with the Afro-Colombian community, and when Stateless came out, they were very intent on having the film screened to a larger Afro-Colombian Women's Collective film festival. And we brought Rosairis on to do the conversation. And I think it was one of the most sort of individually transformative and collectively transformative moments to see a commonality of experience and being able to exchange from a perspective of common history and common humanity. And that for me was sort of the highlight of what the kind of impact the film could have.
What about for you, Rene? How are you thinking about, using your work to engage in community, build community, define community?
The project is tied to sort of a sense of community with other, I guess, second generation US-based Afro-Latinxes, with the desire to sort of engage in wanting to center the experiences of Black Latin Americans, Black Latinxes in the US, and wanting to sort of see myself as being in conversation with sort of work that's already been done maybe in like social media and other forms to discuss that, and sort of within research also wanting to do that. I guess another thing for the dissertation in particular is that I've been thinking about wanting to like find a particular location to focus on the project, because like the Peruvian migrant community within the US is not, there isn't as much of a like spatial association with the Peruvian migrants as there are with, say, like Cubans in Miami or Puerto Ricans in New York, as Peruvian migrants, at least from what I've been able to find in the literature so far, have been dispersed throughout various parts of the US. So it would be, I guess, more complicated, more interesting to really dig into a particularity of a location. So I've been thinking about whether I wanted to do maybe Paterson, New Jersey, which I have some familiarity because of a family friend who lives in Paterson, but also because it's one of the biggest Peruvian American communities in the U.S. But I've also considered going back to the D.C. metro area. I originally am from the D.C. metro area, specifically Maryland, Montgomery County, and thinking about maybe exploring the Peruvian community there, because I know that there is a Peruvian community there at the very least, and it could be a way to sort of, I guess, go back to where I grew up in a different context, and sort of thinking about really trying to create, especially if I were to create, say, oral histories, like not only something for my project, but potentially a data source that could be used later on. And I've also been thinking about, if I were to do something specifically around the DC metro area, wanting to think about how I might turn that project into something that could be engaged by people in that region.
Right. So part of what you're talking about, I mean, I hear kind of three things that with both of you. One is that community can be geographically bounded, but it can also be diasporic, right? And the connections across, and certainly in our current moment, that's far easier to sustain those connections than it would have been, 60 years ago. But the other thing that you're talking about explicitly there is creating like archives that then those communities can actually benefit from, right? And that's part of that more reciprocal and mutual relationship that has echoes in what you were talking about with your filmmaking practice. Am I right, Michele?
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think your note about going beyond boundaries and what community means, certainly the virtual space allows us to do that. But it's also important to, which is why I asked you if you were going to Peru, because it would be interesting to go to Peru and get that other, another perspective on the ground that also sort of informs the local, but the idea that we have to sort of push against these impositions of boundaries, these impositions of borders that really don't define us, or our experiences, that our experiences, even if you go back in history and dig, has always been about movement, right? And going back to, Maroonage and Underground Railroad, all of that is about defying borders and redefining what belonging means, what home means, and what community means. So we're not bound by these borders that are about keeping us out.
So this is maybe a detour, but thinking about, surpassing boundaries and going into new territory, what have you worked on since Stateless, Michele?
Oh, many things. But the most recent one is a hybrid documentary, because we're really sort of playing with form even more so, bringing in Afrofuturist elements of space into this film, and it's titled Going to Mars, the Nikki Giovanni Project. And it's about the poet Nikki Giovanni and her desire to go to space. We really sort of honor her poetry and influence on multiple generations of people. And so that film, we just recently won the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance.
Congratulations.
So we're just started to embark on that journey. So I'm very excited to engage with audiences around the film, the impact it can have. And more recently, just completed a short film for ESPN 30 for 30 titled Black Girls Play, and it's about the hand games that Black girls play. Again, it's cross-diasporic. We have references not just in the U.S., but across the Caribbean and the rest of Latin America, and how the hand games and the games they have played for centuries, from generation to generation, are actually the foundation of our popular culture, from hip-hop to jazz to gospel to even our oratory as Americans.
Well, that's really exciting. We'll have to look out for that. Any advice either of you have, or both of you have, for listeners who are interested in learning more about contemporary Latinx issues? Are there organizations you would like to direct people to, or things to look out for besides your own films, Michele?
So I think what I would say is, particularly if it's for a student, like similar to how I was an undergrad, that if you're interested in doing research or interested in just anything, to trust that your interest is to follow whatever interests you and particularly excites you about anything about the world. Because I think there was an initial hesitation that I had when I was an undergrad thinking about maybe doing research on Afro-Latinos, and particularly Afro-Latino identity, that, none of the classes that I was able to take directly address Afro-Latinos. In my undergrad, there was one Latino studies faculty member, and that wasn't really their area of focus. So there was a lot of hesitation that I had about should I do this if there isn't sort of much that's already preset that I could work from. But then I just committed to it, and I found a lot of joy in being able to explore something that was really interesting. And I sort of similarly, now reflecting on it, had a similar experience again in graduate school, sort of again, especially when I was trying to think about the dissertation, points where, because there was so much limited work on Peruvian studies within Latino studies in general, and even less on Afro-Peruvians, again, do I want to maybe do something else that has treaded a little bit more ground, or am I sort of willing to sort of embark on this project even if there's sort of less things that I could work off of, but deciding to trust that, this is a project I'm interested in, that the interest will be the thing that drives me to do it, is what I ended up deciding to do. So I guess it would be, whatever it is, to trust that interest and try to explore and see what you can find.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with what he says about finding joy, the interest, which is really about passion. That will, you'll wake up in the morning with that passion. For me, filmmaking is it's not a job, it's a vocation. It's what I do from the moment I get up to the time I go to bed. And I feel lucky to be able to have found that sort of vocation, that mission, that purpose. I think purpose is a really important part too. And it's not something you necessarily find right away. Like I said, it took me a while to get to where I'm at, but all of those parts of the journey have informed and maybe even made me more resolute and confident of knowing where I'm at and what I'm doing is right for me. So I think this idea of trusting your interests and your passion, even if there's nothing out there necessarily. In fact, see that as opportunity for engagement and discovery.
create the thing that you wish was there in the world.
Exactly. And there's nothing more fulfilling than that. And so, but it's hard to do that with all the noise sometimes that's around you and sort of pushing you in certain directions. So it might take a while, but taking the time to sort of listen to yourself at some point and see, am I happy in what I'm doing, is really important. And that's a chapter I'm taking from Nikki Giovanni and how she has lived her life unapologetically. And so that is, certainly. And then, in terms of students or younger people, think about that point of reference. Who inspires you? What can be your beacons to follow that may not necessarily be your exact track, but that their approach to life. For me, that's been really important.
Well, thank you both so much for talking with me today. Listeners can keep up with ICS by following us on Twitter and Instagram at ICS-BGSU and on our Facebook page. To learn more about the Latino IX Issues Conference, you can visit bgsu.edu/Latino Issues. You can listen to Big Ideas wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please subscribe and rate us on your preferred platform. For more information or to propose a guest for a future episode, you can visit us at bgsu.edu/BG Ideas. Sound engineering for this episode was provided by Marco Mendoza and Brendan Akatura. Research for this episode was done by Iswat Damiola Janad and Joe Elia. The Ethnic Cultural Arts program at BGSU provided significant support for this year's Latino IX Issues Conference.